This is the Simply Love Jesus podcast, where we explore life and faith through the lens of one question: what does it mean to simply love Jesus? We're here with the bro, Caleb, and here with my girlfriend, Olivia.
The music director.
Yes.
You got to introduce her properly. The music director of Simply Love Jesus Ministries.
The music director of Simply Love Jesus. She's all right. So we're at Blue Agave, and we just enjoyed some good food. And so how you been, Caleb?
Good. I did nothing this weekend. It was great. It was a weekend where I was like finally finished with some projects, and it's like I've been working on them for months, and I was finally done with it, and I was like, all right, the next 2 days, I got other stuff I got to work on, but for these next 2 days, nothing. I'm going to sit home, play video games, watch Obi-Wan Kenobi, and eat food and cook food, and then play with my dog, and that was it. And so it's been pretty chill.
So how is that Obi-Wan Kenobi thing? I heard some
It's so good
things.
It's so good. And there's a lot of haters out there, and I don't like it. I'll tell them, go get a life and be a real Star Wars fan, because here's the reason. People don't like the fact that, I'm going to go on a whole tangent. This is going to be related to the episode, but we're about to get into it, people. People don't like a lot of people don't like the Obi-Wan Kenobi show because they don't like that Obi-Wan is he's like broken. They don't like that he's broken. He's essentially like almost forgotten how to fight with a lightsaber. He's not connected to the Force anymore. And people don't like that. And they're like, no, that's not Obi-Wan. He's supposed to be like powerful and all put together and the next best thing since Jesus. Like, no, like Obi-Wan, he's like, the thing I love about the show is they're exploring what created the incredible Ben Kenobi that we see in episode 4. The wise, powerful sage who's like watching over Luke, all these things, and we're like, what turned him into that? And where we last left off with him in episode 3 was that Obi-Wan was this. He's gone through hard things. Like he's lost a loved one. He lost essentially his father figure in his life to Darth Maul in episode 1. But in episode 3, like he not only in his mind killed his brother, what was like his brother, and thus also failed to fulfill his father figure's dying wish. And then at the process of failing to train his own brother figure right, and failing to train Anakin right, he created Darth Vader, who was responsible for wiping out all of his entire worldview. The entire Jedi Order is wiped out. So you have this. I was hoping and praying. I was like tweeting Star Wars every single day when I saw that they were beginning writing this show, and I was like, please make Obi-Wan this broken PTSD trauma-filled man. Do not give me this perfect put-together guy. And they did, and I love it because we're seeing him just go through so many things. And there's this encounter where you find out in the show that he didn't know Anakin Skywalker survived. He thought he killed him. So there's this moment in the show where this Inquisitor is hunting him down, and this Inquisitor is like, I'm taking you back to him. And then you see this, like he perfectly acts like a straight up, like he got like PTSD triggered, like where he's straight up like he's like Anakin Skywalker's alive, and you just see the horror on his face, and everything about this show is amazing. There's some things I would change, like they don't do alien languages enough, and maybe a couple other things, but all in all, the show is like 20 out of 10. So good, and I love what they're doing with it. So
I'm not even gonna lie, I'm not that much of a Star Wars fan, but
well, you should be now.
Well, it's a lot to get into.
It is a lot to get into because the Star Wars is without people realizing it, it's essentially like a religion. Like the way that it's set up, when George Lucas designed Star Wars, he designed it to reflect the same ideas of like Greek myths. That's how he decided them. So Greek myths back in the day were these stories that you would tell that for the purpose of teaching like life lessons and lessons of value to people. And so that's what George Lucas also did. He took these he made it a myth, like a mythology. There's a whole inner working universe, and it all comes back to the same 3 themes of reconciliation, good will always triumph over evil, and family. Those are like the 3 things that make Star Wars hold together. And he built like this, essentially just an entire like worldview within it. And it's like so deep and profound when you just watch it and you see the things that he's inspired by. But it's a lot to get into. But it's totally worth it.
Yeah, I know, because it rubs you out the wrong way when people say Star Trek.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
No,
we should have a marathon, and I make you watch all the movies in that way.
I would prefer to watch Star Trek.
No. How are you doing, Olivia?
Hey guys, it's your girl Olivia here. I was really excited to say that. But yeah, I am the music director for Simply Love Jesus, also aka Adrian's boo thing. Yeah, I've been doing well. This weekend was pretty good for me too. I had a pretty overall chill weekend. Had a few things going on, but even the things that I had going on were chill things. So just hanging out with people and doing life with people. So that's always fun and chill. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, I'm doing well.
That's good. We were at the Antonize Is Not Just a Moment thing on Thursday. It was so good, dude.
Bruh.
They got
when
some
I
good
tell you my
things
soul
going.
left my body, I was just there just doing multimedia work.
That's
It's
you
just,
gotta send me that photo you tagged me in. That was in your story.
Yeah,
that was a good one.
But it's just Antonius is like, it's just like his energy.
Yeah.
That was real great.
He's just gifted. Like, he's very gifted and has a passion to just see people.
And a passion
worship.
just to be his.
Yeah, great people. It was a great event. Looking forward to the next one. And if you're in Atlanta, hit us up. We'll give you the details for the next one when we know about it. But yeah.
So last episode we was like the Israelites in the wilderness, specifically Exodus chapter 16.
Yep.
With quail and manna.
Yep.
And we
give us our daily bread.
Yes, rain from heaven. Amen. But we were talking about the bad fruit being doubt, and we were talking about the good fruit being trust.
Yeah. Why do we call it bad fruit for those who may be listening to the first time?
We call it bad fruit because we're trying to compare it to the spiritual fruits, but also because that's actually what happened in the context of history throughout the Bible. So it's pretty essentially what the character in the Bible did wrong, and the good fruit is how one of the spiritual fruits or a byproduct of the spiritual fruit that they should have done in that, and we try to correlate that to what the whole theme around is talks his relationship with God, and how our relationship with God is a reflection of how our relationship with people, and we try to tie that in between so people can walk away with not just being biblically taught, but also practical things they can use in their relationships.
Why is it that they we use fruit because the Bible uses fruit?
Yes.
So why is it that the Bible calls it fruit?
Well, Bible calls it fruit is because they use plants and other things throughout the Bible as something that's fruit-bearing, growth, something that grows and matures and is nurtured and watered, especially like the more that you read the Bible and the scripture, is because that's a byproduct of like what the Holy Spirit is within you, and what it should be looking like if you're living a life where you're simply loving Jesus.
That's right. That's exactly right. I mean, it's because the Bible uses fruit because it wanted to draw our attention using trees as an illustration, and just like trees produce fruit, and fruit can become rotten. Fruit can produce bad fruit, like fruit that you realize, I'm not picking that. That's not good fruit. But you see one that's ripe, and you're like, I want that fruit. That's good fruit. And that's why the Bible uses fruit and uses trees as a parallel for humanity and growth, because it teaches us the similar idea of what God should be doing within us. The idea that we are like the trees, and God is the one who planted us. And the reality is, when we grow with His water, when we grow with the good water and we're in good soil, and you take that illustration as far as you want, the reality is when we're growing because of God. And so like the same reason that trees don't grow without the rain, trees do not grow without the sun. And in the same way, we do not grow on our own strength. We can't grow ourselves. We're reliant. If we're going to grow spiritually, we have to rely on God spiritually. We have to rely on, this is why Jesus said, come to me all who are thirsty, and I will give you drink. You will not come to me and you won't be thirsty again. Or in Revelation, when it says, I saw that from the throne of God was flowing a river, and each river then produced a tree of life. Like, it's this idea always comes back to water and Him being the living water. And so when we grow through him, through his living water, we should be producing fruit if we are like a tree. And that fruit can be love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faith, self-control, righteousness, and all these other things,
So in today's episode, we're going to be going over David and Bathsheba, and we're going to be pulling that from 2 Samuel chapter 11.
Ooh.
And we'll talk about also chapter 12 as well, since that is behind it, and is a good coincide of what David did and what he did affected with what the prophet Nathan told him. What prophet Nathan told him that the Lord told him to say.
Okay.
So Caleb, in between episode 3, where the Israelites are in the wilderness, in Exodus chapter 16, and until 2 Samuel chapter 11,
we
got
a lot of ground to cover.
So, fill the people in.
Yes. So, the last time in the last episode where we last left off, we were with the Hebrews when they were in the wilderness. Well, they were in the desert. I say desert because when I think wilderness, I think of the backwoods of Georgia, and we go back there hunting for stuff. And that's not how it was back then. I was like, they were in the desert. They were in the Middle East. And so they were in the desert, and they were surviving. They were there for 40 years because they were waiting for God to lead them into the promised land. And after they eventually did go into the promised land, it was actually essentially Moses's number one disciple, essentially Joshua, and then also Caleb. Shout out to your boy. Led them into they fulfilled what Moses started, and they led them into the promised land. And eventually, they began to expand. They began to settle the land, and throughout that settling process, they continued to have problems. They continued to struggle to remain faithful to God, and so eventually God appointed people like judges, these people who are essentially like tribal war leaders who helped steer the people of Israel back to the right path, following God, defending the people, defending them from the Philistines and all these other surrounding nations. They're still settling the land, and in the midst of their settling, they desired, the people of Israel wanted to become like the other countries. They didn't want to be like what God had intended for them. They wanted to be, instead of fully reliant on God, they said, we need to be like these other nations. They have a king, so make us a king. And so God appoints Saul. The people appointed Saul. They voted for him because he was wise and he was a good military leader and he was very respectable and loved by all the people. And so the people appointed Saul. And Saul led them really well for a good while, and he helped begin to unite the people. But then Saul began to have a selfish heart, and he no longer trusted God. He went about his own ways of doing things. And so God took away his anointing, and then he gave his anointing to a little dude named David, who was a little shepherd boy. And eventually you have this prophet named Samuel who comes and he finds David and he anoints him to be the king. And there's this awesome moment where David makes himself so prominent in the nation of Israel because he slays this giant named Goliath with his sling, and he actually used a sword and cut off his head, but we don't really talk about that in Sunday school. And so, but he has these stones and he slays him just like he slayed the bear and a lion as he was just being a shepherd. And it said that David was a man after God's own heart, and that he loved the Lord. And so he began to become rise in popularity, rise in influence. And eventually he becomes king. Eventually he takes his rightful place as the anointed king of Israel, anointed by God. And he is still hailed to this day as like this almost mythological figure in Judaism of the greatest king of Israel. And he united the kingdoms, and he brought them under one banner where they were divided. They were heavily divided, but he brought them together. And so in his kingliness, though, he still made mistakes. And so one of the mistakes that he made while being king is what we're going to be highlighting today.
Before we dive into the episode, I'd like to hear Olivia's opinion of like how she thinks things are gonna this episode will go, and also because she's been listening for a while now.
Foreshadow for us what you think how it's gonna go down.
Well, I don't want to give the story away, but I will say I believe that you're gonna see David's humanity, when he's titled as a man after God's own heart, we can kind of put like a perfectionist, kind of like David's the closest thing to God at this point. And so you really see his humanity in this, and that he is flawed. He is not perfect, although he is very loved by God and even the people. As a great king, he is still a man. He still struggles with sin like everyone else. And so we're going to see that unfold in a pretty crazy way. Like, this could be a whole movie. I'm not sure why it's not a movie yet. Maybe it is. I don't know. But yeah, it's going to be some wild stuff in here. But at the end of the day, it just points us back to our need for Jesus and our need for rescue and redemption. So, yeah.
Good stuff.
So, Caleb, can you read 2 Samuel chapter 11 for us?
Already got it pulled up for you. All right. Here we go, friends. Do me a favor. Sit back. If you're driving, don't close your eyes. But if you are not driving, do me a favor. I want you to sit back, get all comfy in your chair or whatever you're doing right now. Take a moment. Just kind of picture this around you and picture this true event, but this story that we're going to read for you. 2 Samuel chapter 11, starting in verse 1. This week I'm going to read from the NLT. In the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. They destroyed the Ammonite army and laid siege to the city of Rabbah. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. Late one afternoon, after his midday rest, David got out of bed and was walking on the roof of the palace. As he looked out over the city, he noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking a bath. He sent someone to find out who she was, and he was told, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her, and when she came to the palace, he slept with her. She had just completed the purification rites after having her menstrual period. Then she returned home. Later, when Bathsheba discovered that she was pregnant, she sent David a message letting him know, saying, "I'm pregnant." Then David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." So Joab sent him to David. When Uriah arrived, David asked how Joab and the army were getting along and how the war was progressing. Then he told Uriah, "Go home and relax." David didn't even sent a gift to Uriah after he had left the palace. But Uriah didn't go home. He slept that night at the palace entrance with the king's palace guard. When David heard that Uriah had not gone home, he summoned him and asked, "What's the matter? Why didn't you go home last night after being away for so long?" Uriah replied, "The ark and the armies of Israel and Judah are living in tents, and Joab and my master's men are camping in the open fields. How could I go home to wine and dine and sleep with my wife? I swear that I would never do such a thing." "Well, stay here today," David told him, "and tomorrow you may return to the army." So Uriah stayed in Jerusalem that day and the next. Then David invited him to dinner and got him drunk. But even then, he couldn't get Uriah to go home to his wife. Again, he slept at the palace entrance with the king's palace guard. So the next morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and gave it to Uriah to deliver. The letter instructed Joab, "Station Uriah on the front lines where the battle is fiercest. Then pull back so that he will be killed." So Joab assigned Uriah to a spot close to the city wall where he knew the enemy's strongest men were fighting. And when the enemy soldiers came out of the city to fight, Uriah the Hittite was killed along with several other Israelite soldiers. Then Joab sent a battle report to David. He told his messenger, "Report all the news of the battle to the king," but he might get angry and ask, "Why did the troops go so close to the city? Didn't they know there would be shooting from the walls? Wasn't Abimelech, son of Gideon, killed at Thebez by a woman who threw a millstone down on him from the wall? Why would you get so close to the wall?" Then tell him Uriah the Hittite was killed too. So the messenger went to Jerusalem and gave a complete report to David. "The enemy came out against us in the open field," he said, "and as we chased them back to the city gate, the archers on the wall shot arrows at us. Some of the king's men were killed, including Uriah the Hittite. Well, "Tell Joab not to be discouraged," David said. "The sword devours this one today and that one tomorrow. Fight harder next time and conquer the city." When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. When the period of mourning was over, David sent for her and brought her to the palace, and she became one of his wives, and then she gave birth to a son. But the Lord was displeased with what David had done.
How do you feel hearing that, what David did to Bathsheba and it being in the Bible, as far as him sleeping with her, knowing that she had a husband, and then also him sending her husband out to the front lines and getting him killed?
Kind of like I just talked about earlier with like David's humanity. It just, for me, it just kind of shows like the sinful nature. Like, we have the capacity or the potential to do anything like as heinous. Like, no one would probably say that they would do anything like that, but we have that potential. And just like David, basically used his power to take advantage of someone and try to cover it up by doing something even worse. You kind of just see that, like, man, like, we are very sinful beings. And in the past, reading this story, you can very much look at it from a very judgmental point of view of like, dang, David, you really screwed up. But it's like, man, my sins are the same. You know what I mean? Like, I may have not have done anything specifically like what he did, but my heart posture has been in that place where I've basically done things out of my own desires, my own passions, and letting that fleshly desire lead me into doing heinous things that I shouldn't have done, like, or I would be too embarrassed to tell anybody about. But the fact that we have record of this in the Bible, it just is like, man, like, this is like a mirror. Like, we're looking at ourselves, and what if our dirty laundry was put on Front Street like this? We would be like, feel super ashamed. But like, we also know that God obviously uses David in a huge way. But yeah, I mean, it's a sad story, because it just didn't have to happen. And then obviously with Uriah being killed, it's like he's like an innocent bystander in this because he did nothing wrong. And I mean, Bathsheba either, but it's just, I don't know. It's very sad, but it's also, man, like, this just shows our desperation for, we just need help. We need a lot of help. And yeah, thank God for Jesus.
So, Caleb, what disturbs you as a man of God, hearing, what David had did, because we look to the Bible for instruction of how to be a man, and up to this point, David still is characterized as a man after God's own heart. How do you look at him in a different light, in your own opinion?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things to talk about. I'll talk about the first thing that comes to mind is we tend to not, at least in the past, I tended to not take a notice of just how severe his wrongs were, because not only did he have an affair with someone that wasn't his wife, not only did you then send a righteous guy out to go get killed, because notice that, like, he had a sense of honor and duty. He was like, you send me home, I'm not going to go home to my wife. I'm going to stay here with the troops because they're out fighting. Why do I get to rest? Like, you got this guy who's, even when he got him drunk, he was still like, nah, I'm sitting here with my troops. Like, this is the right thing to do. So he sends a righteous man out to go get killed, all to cover up for this story. But even deeper than that, it notes that David saw Bathsheba bathing, and then it says he sent for her. Now we can't assume, we can't directly say that this is what happened, but there is a lot of speculation based around the data that the fact of, if the king says something, you don't say no to the king. So it is not far-fetched to kind of place this assumption of David's affair with Bathsheba may not have been totally consensual. it could have been later on, could have grown to become that later on, but there's a good argument that it wasn't, because it was more coercion, like I'm the king. Now, we also don't know, because there's a lot of details we don't have. There are also, it could very well be a possibility it was consensual, because this doesn't just assume Bathsheba was innocent. She could have been like, oh my God, the king noticed me. Like, you don't know what, there's a lot of details we don't have. But the reality is, what we do know for a fact, regardless of whether it was a consensual thing or not, it was still an abuse of power. All of these layers go into how deeply flawed David was. But the important thing is, we tend to make mistakes of interpreting things in the Bible based on what we've read later in the Bible. So you got to remember, like, at this point, there were laws that they had established, but there wasn't really much of an organized Judaism. Like, as a religion, like, they're still trying to figure out what it means to follow God. And they're all deeply messed up. Like, they constantly do horrible, horrible things. But part of it is also, it's not like they had a temple and they had all these things. It's not like it's like church today, where you just know you're not supposed to do this or not supposed to do that. It's a journey in the process. And granted, there are things that we know are not right in the Lord's eye. That's why the prophets were there, who tell the people what it means to follow God and deliberately disobey it. And so it's a balance of things, of knowing that, like, one, yes, an abuse of power, but two, the other thing is noticing that, like, this is also a place and time where they're still trying to figure out what it means to follow God. They're still more slave to their own selfish nature than they realize. There's a lot of thoughts that go around it, but primarily just recognizing that, like, not only is it common that we see David who abused his power, but it's also a reflection of what happens when in our own world today. Like, you see pastors who abuse their power. Look at the SBC, 700 pastors that the SBC Executive Committee intentionally knew of and covered up, of 700 abusive pastors, of cases of abuse, reported cases that were done nothing about because they didn't want to damage the reputation of the SBC. Like, these things happen all the time, and it shows that a system of power, which is why, me personally, that's why I don't like when, we refer to, like, other, like, I'm very hesitant when we refer to other ministers as, like, bishop so-and-so. Oh, what's up, bishop? What's up? Pastor is like one thing. It just depends on the tone in which it's used. But the tone in which it's used, it's one thing if you're just, like, joking, like, what's up, pastor? Like, whatever. But when you constantly are attributing, like, this, it's bishop so-and-so, it's apostle so-and-so, whatever. Like, you have these things that slowly begin to contribute to that same unhealthy mindset of giving men a specific feeling of authority and power that they're not intended to have, because it's too much temptation that leads them astray. So what happens next, Adrian? What happens next?
So what happens next is that David does get rebuked by God, but prophet Nathan is sent as God's messenger to rebuke him, and he rebukes him in the best way that, as we come to further know, that how God and Jesus likes to talk in parables. So Nathan rebukes David, and the parable is that one was rich and one was poor. The rich man owned a great many sheep and cattle, and the poor man owned nothing but one little lamb, but he had brought. He raised that little lamb, and it grew up with his children. It ate from the man's own plate and drank from his cup. He cuddled it in his arms like a baby daughter. One day, a guest arrived at the home of the rich man, but instead of killing an animal from his own flock or herd, he took the poor man's lamb and killed it and prepared it for its guest. So that was just 2 Samuel chapter 12, 2 Samuel chapter 12, 1 through 4. And this is the NLT version.
And it really is a crazy moment because, as you said, Nathan tells the story to David. He tells the story that God gave him. He gave him this little parable, as you just read for us. And David, as we all know, like, especially if you're reading it, it's like he gets furious and he says, he's got to repay him. He's got to do these things, which is really interesting to think about how oftentimes, it makes me think of even, like, pastors today who some of the, I just keep going back because it's so recent, but those pastors, that list of 700 pastors, I wonder how many of them were like so fervently preaching against maybe the same sins they were committing. You often find that very true in society. People tend to be so much more zealous and preach zealously about the things that they are committing. And so David, he's like naturally just like, this guy needs to be taken care of. That's so wrong, yada, yada. And Nathan's like, well, that's you. You're the person. You're the person in this story. And he even goes in and he gives this very specific rebuke from God. This is the Lord God of Israel says, I anointed you king of Israel and saved you from the power of Saul. I gave you your master's house and his wives and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And if it had not been enough, I even given you much, much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord and done this horrible deed? For you have murdered Uriah the Hittite with the sword of the Ammonites and stolen his wife. From this time on, then he gives him almost a curse. He says, this time on, your family will live by the sword because you have despised me by taking Uriah's wife to be your own. This is what the Lord says. Because of what you've done, I will cause your own household to rebel against you. I will give your wives to another man before your very eyes, and he will go to bed with them in public view. You did it secretly, but I will make this happen to you openly in the sight of all Israel. Now, something that's really important to discuss here is, does that mean God is causing all these bad things to happen to David? It's really important to note that that the reality is God did not do evil against David. In this context, the language that's being spoken is helping people understand that like God orchestrates all things, and God allows evil to happen in the world. He allows us, but one of the things is, even though some sins, these are the consequences of our actions, he's essentially allows, not necessarily that God is the one who forces these things. He doesn't force his son to rebel against him, but he essentially, by allowing it, he's saying, this is what's going to happen to you. And that's why, because the language is like, I will cause these things by allowing it. I'm going to cause these things by allowing this to happen. Like, that's essentially the sovereignty of God, because back then their reality was God causes everything. He allows it to happen, but he's still good. And so he allows these things to happen because it's the natural consequences of our sins, or things that are just going to happen as a result of them later on. And reaping of those things, reaping what you've sowed, essentially.
And just another point with that is even just the idea of the Nathans in your life. You know, like, I think I love this part because it's like we all need a Nathan. You know what I mean? Because sometimes we can be so high and lofty in our spiritual view of ourselves, and we just kind of like I don't know, I think it's in Matthew, but it's like, get the plank out of your own eye before you like try to take the sawdust. So it's like we can all get in that, you know, where we're just like, oh, you're doing wrong, and we can clearly see everyone else's wrongs, but we somehow are blind to our own. And so like you were talking about with the SBC and the 700, like, where was their Nathan? Like, you know, it's like God favored David by bringing him someone to kind of open his eyes to the truth. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, of course, God could have opened his eyes in any way, but he used a man. Yeah. He used Nathan. God could have came down from heaven and said, David, look at what you've done. And like, you know, put terror and fear in his heart. But he sent Nathan, and Nathan does it in the way that God tells him to do it. And all it does is obviously rebuke and show David himself. But, you know, obviously David, it humbled him and it brought him to his knees, and it made him see his wrong and, you know, plead and beg God for mercy, because we know something tragic's going to happen after this. So, you know, I guess it just shows the beauty of people and how God does use people. And he uses people to encourage us, lift us up, but also rebuke us when we need it. So
well, it also raises the question, because you said, you know, you look at the like 700 SBC pastors or whatever, where was their Nathan? Well, that's the question. Where was their Nathan? Do we have an answer? Like, what do you
Maybe
think?
They were supposed to be each other's Nathan. But, you know,
Yeah, it was like, the reality is, I think we asked those questions, where is the Nathan? Where is the Nathan in this country? The reality is, there is no Nathan. We don't have a Nathan because we've set up a system that doesn't allow for it. We have created a system in our nation that has that, and part of this is due. Actually, I may get crap for this, but that's okay. I would say the reason for this is because of the Protestant Reformation. So when we split off from the Catholic Church, and for good reasons, we split off because the Catholic Church was doing a lot of corrupt things. But the reality is they actually would have had that system in place. That's where you had your bishop or the pope or whatever. You had someone that you answered to. Now, they were not good stewards of that system, and as a result, Protestant Reformation happened. But now we live in this place where it is only the people of influence. If you can get famous enough, then you got the word to be able to say it. But that's not how Jesus works. God don't give two craps about how famous you are in this earth. Like, God does not care about your Emmys or your Grammys. God don't care about your best-selling
followers
books.
You got.
He don't care about your Instagram followers. He don't care if you're a best-selling author. God do not care about how famous you are in this world. It does not. God is the one who appoints the Nathan, not us. And for a long time, we've tried to appoint the Nathans, and we've tried to say, well, I'm just the David with no Nathan. And that's how we are both the David and the Nathan. And that's how a lot of people have tried to function in leadership in our country. But we have to begin to figure out the answer to how do we allow the Nathans in the world? How do we allow the Nathans in our life? When are we really going to know what it means to be Spirit-led? We got a lot of churches that fake what it means being Spirit-led. We be led by the Spirit, but we don't really know what it means to be Spirit-led. If we really wanted to be Spirit-led, we would be praying for God to appoint a Nathan over us. Nobody praying for that, though.
Nobody.
Ain't nobody praying for
Nobody.
Who will you appoint to hold me account? Who will you appoint to be the Nathan for us?
Right.
And that's a conversation we need to have. Are we going to be so Spirit-led that we actually pray for our own accountability?
Right.
That we pray for not just our peer accountability, but an authority of higher accountability.
Yeah. And I definitely agree. Like, I was going to ask you the question is just like, so at this point, is it just a lack of accountability in the church or not desiring it? Because, like, you would think, with the church setup is like you have, the elders and stuff like that. It's like you would think there's some point of accountability there as far as like, you have the elder board or whatever, and you have your head pastor, but that's kind of a part of that elder's job is to kind of help with that accountability run, make sure that the pastor is teaching biblically and living, all that kind of stuff. So it's like, do we have just a bunch of people or leaders in the church that really don't want?
So the answer for that is kind of like multifold thing. The answer for that really comes down to the reality where on one hand, you have pastors in the nation who just don't want that accountability. You have people who just say, I am the last say, I'm the one who's leading this. But you also do have, elders who are the ones who are supposed to be appointed, who are supposed to be the authority, who are supposed to be like the Nathans. But the hard part is we just live in a system and we live in a world where the church is just so broken. And it's been broken for years, going all the way back to the Reformation and even before that, way before that, with the Catholic Church, and a bunch of corruption took place. And it came to the point where a lot of times when it comes to areas of leadership and how we run a church, a lot of it is us filling in the blanks, and we focus on what the Bible doesn't say. Like, with the 5-finger leadership model, this is idea in leadership for the past several years, where is the idea of like, you have a shepherd, or you have a apostle, and you have a prophet, and a shepherd, and a pastor, and a teacher. And there's different leadership models, but the reality is, the Bible never says what those are supposed to look like. So how do we know what those function like today? Well, we fill in the blanks, and we do that for a lot of things in the Bible in our modern church, and we spend so much time filling in the blanks on what the Bible doesn't say that we just miss what it is trying to say. The reality is every leader, every Christian should grow to become a shepherd. They should grow to, even if it's not their natural gifting, if they're just not naturally built like that, you still got to do it. You still need to do it. If you have to learn how to build relationships, how to shepherd people, how to walk with them. And there's so many things, but at the end of the day, we live in a world where it's such a problem for how broken our system is as a church that it's set us up to where there are systems appointed and systems in place that have continued to produce this bad fruit of leaders. When you want to talk about good fruit, bad fruit, it's like looking at this reality of the fruit that we have produced as a church. Is it producing good fruit or bad fruit? And we've produced a lot of good things, but we've also produced a lot of bad things as well. But even through that, I think a follow-up question could even be going into, okay, well, one of the things that we could talk about, though, as we're on this kind of discussion of a Nathan and all of these things, like, what should our response be for that? Even looking at this story, like, what really is the core problem of this issue and this event that happened? This idea of what is the good fruit or the bad fruit in this scenario? We're looking at David and Bathsheba, and we look at the whole point of this series is toxic relationships with God. And so the idea is, what is toxic in this scenario? What was toxic about this situation?
Well, the toxicity was the lust that David had, and just David not being.
What kind of lust?
Well, lust is sexual immorality.
Yeah, but there's also more than that too, right?
Well, it's false idolatry,
Well,
but lust is pretty much just, not being satisfied, honestly.
So I'm thinking, like, it's not just the lust of David lusting for Bathsheba, like physically. Yeah. There's also the lust for power. The fact that he could just write a letter, send him to the front lines, get this guy out of my life. I'm gonna cover this whole situation up. That woman, I want her. Bring her to me. Like, there's a lust not just for her, but a lust for power as well. But lust is that core issue. And man, is it an issue that drives so many of us without realizing it. Hey friends, this is Caleb. I just want to thank you so much for taking a moment and tuning in to this episode that we have for you. This is a really, really interesting episode. We spent a long time talking about this conversation about David and Bathsheba, and we decided to split this into 2 parts. And so to hear the next part for this episode, you're going to have to wait until next week and then come back, because me, Adrian, and Olivia, we continue this conversation, and it gets really, really spicy, for lack of better words. But for those of you who've been listening, thank you so much for tuning in. We just want to encourage you to follow us on Instagram at SLJ Ministries. Also follow us on TikTok at SLJ Ministries. You can follow us on Twitter at SLJ Ministries, but that's really up to you. You don't have to, but we would appreciate it. We would appreciate the love. But for those who have been tuning in for a long time, again, thank you so much. You don't know how much we appreciate you. You don't know how much we appreciate your contributions to our ministry. You don't know how much we appreciate even the smallest things, like writing a review and telling somebody else how much you love this podcast. And speaking of which, if you haven't written a review yet, we really would love that. You could write it down on Apple Podcasts, or if you're just using Spotify, then we would be so encouraged if you would just share this episode with one person. We are, again, in a series called Toxic Relationships with God. And if you've been getting a lot out of this series, then please send us a DM. Let us know how this series has been teaching you and challenging you to have a healthier relationship with God, to help you identify maybe some toxic things in your mindset and your thinking, ways in your heart that has created or cultivated a harmful or a toxic thinking that has ruined or distorted your relationship with God. And that's what we're trying to fix. We're trying to help you have a healthy relationship with God so that you can have healthy relationships with other people. And so in this episode, as you heard, we're starting to dive into this idea of lust and love. And you're going to hear more about that next week, because we actually take this conversation between David and Bathsheba and go on an even deeper level and talk about how we not only can have a love for God, but we can also have a lust for God. But to hear more about that, you're going to have to wait till next week. So that being said, send us a message on Instagram. Let us know how we can pray for you.